essentially in the 1970s, if you had looked at Boston, the Route 128 area, and Silicon Valley, and somebody asked you to bet on which one is going to win out in the technology race, you would have been crazy to bet on the West Coast. Silicon Valley was sort of small firms. It was far away from New York, from funding, from DC, from the centers of economic and political power. It had MIT. It had, tremendous industrial history. But I think the newness, the greenfield features of Silicon Valley became its advantage because the founders of this place, the people who really populated it first, they didn't know how to run a business. They didn't know what it means to grow up as a corporation. So they created a different model of how you run a company.
But I think the most important evolution, and again, it's evolutionary, is that companies here and venture capitalists, investors here, are very accepting of failure. You can start a company and fail in Silicon Valley, and you still have a chance to start another company. And that's pretty unique.
I think when the historians write the story of the technology revolution of the 21st century, the digital revolution, the demographic transformation of Silicon Valley will be at the heart of it. In the early days, the US benefited from the fact that this sort of brain drain allowed us to tap really the most highly skilled, the best and the brightest from India and China and Taiwan, Hong Kong, diaspora Chinese.
I think a few years after Intel was formed, Andy Grove, who actually recruited me out of Stanford, called me to see if I want to join Intel. So that's how I went to Intel. 1984, I became involved with microprocessors. And I've been in charge of microprocessor at Intel for about 16 years.
Lam Research was the first company that went public in Silicon Valley and in any high-tech market that was led and founded by an Asian American. So for that, I'm very proud.
But those are the days that very few people really take the risk of starting company. And being an immigrant of so many continents, and therefore, for me, was, if you can live on a deck of top of deck of a boat, and when it rains, you have to find cover. Because of that, and for me to start a company is nothing, So that's why I was able to start many companies.
But when you're not happy with what the environment you're in, you think you could do better. Then you want to create, you want to get out and do something different. And in my particular case, since I was a kid, 3-4 years old, and I really out on the street selling fruits. So I had that, genes, in my blood, I guess, from my family.
To be an entrepreneur, stubbornness is one of the basic requirements, I believe. Once you see something that there are value that other people cannot see, what you need is smart ideas, good engineers, but your stubbornness, so that you can stick on this, pushing it through until get the job done.
Well, I think entrepreneurship goes across. It's a spirit. It's a feeling. It's what's part of you. Being stubborn, taking risks, basically saying it is not enough what has been done, but looking at what more problems have to be solved.
But at the same time, when I was looking around in those days for some support, for some guidance, advice, and mentoring, it was very difficult. Because in those days, most Asian Americans are not perceived to be able to manage companies, lead companies.
Sometimes it's not the challenge, the difficulty of it. It's the loneliness that you're fighting it by yourself. And then the kind of thing is just, am I the only one to have to encounter all those difficulties?
So there was a very dire need to break into the mainstream, so to speak, for these entrepreneurs to be known, to get into the mainstream of things, to be recognized.
AAMA's charter is really how we can help the new young entrepreneur for their next step.
What happened in Silicon Valley in the late 70s and 80s was that these groups essentially mobilized. First the Chinese Institute of Engineers, then the AAMA, then the Indian entrepreneurs. They created networks of self-support not that different, frankly, from the Chinatowns. They helped invest in one another's businesses, they helped advise them about business, and the older generations helped the next generations. By the end of the 90s, 25% of the companies started in Silicon Valley were started by Indian and Chinese entrepreneurs. So very, very, and recent data, in 2005, that number had grown closer to 50%, again, now mirroring their representation in the engineering workforce.
When I started here in the early 1980s, I knew this was the sort of the center of high tech, but I had no idea just how extensive and how durable that innovation engine would be. And I think the past 20, 30 years have proved that Silicon Valley is by far the world's greatest innovation crucible.
It's just in everybody's DNA once they're out here. And that's something that, candidly, if I had stayed on the East Coast, I probably would not have gone off and started my own company. And I think that was, being an investment banker back in the late 90s, during the dot-com bubble, you know, seeing all these companies being formed and advising them, you know, through IPOs and M&A situations, you know, really gave me the itch to want to go off and start my own company.
And at Sycamore, I came up with an idea which I presented to some local VCs. And one of the VC funds also had an outpost in the valley on Sand Hill Road. And I ended up getting an entrepreneur in residence position with that fund here on the West Coast, and that's what brought me to California. And then I teamed up with a couple of local highly successful entrepreneurs and pursued some ideas. And I moved from that venture fund where I started to another fund which was located literally 2 doors in the same building. And that's where I incubated my current company, Navitas Networks.
I came in 1995 from the East Coast when Bell Lab, AT&T Bell Lab transferred a group of, you know, like what they call the Lab West pioneer over to the valley here. And it was actually very, very exciting. But to me, you know, another thing that really amazed me is to see the contribution and the impact and the recognition of Asian American in the valley.
Was guided, you know, largely by my father actually to come back to the Bay Area, you know, join a small company, join a startup, really to learn business, use my engineering skills, but going to small company to you know, get exposed to the business side as well. So it was basically 8 years after undergrad that got together with my co-founder and eventually started this company.
Whatever one does, one should do to his or her best ability. So in order to do your best, you have to really love what you're doing. So not only do you do it out of sense of duty or responsibility, but there has to be real passion behind it.
Our generation has relatively gone beyond or moved away from that minimum requirement of life. So then you're looking for other excitement. When my parents heard I am going to law school, they were both medical doctors, and they questioned my choice. But I went ahead anyway. And because I felt I need a profession that's people-oriented.
Often being Asians or being raised as Asian Americans, we're taught to be risk-averse. To be an entrepreneur is to be sort of fundamentally crazy from the start. And when you talk about failures, as a VC, I have to live with a 75% failure rate because almost every startup you back is pretty much doomed to failure. So it's something you live with every day.